At my birthday dinner in the fanciest restaurant in downtown Millbrook, my sister Clarissa stood up in front of 30 guests, clinked her champagne flute with her diamond-encrusted nails, and announced loud enough for neighboring tables to hear. Let's be honest, everyone. While the rest of us are building real careers and living actual lives, my sister Jade here is perfectly content with her little apartment, her secondhand Honda, and her simple life. Some people just don't have bigger dreams, I suppose. The laughter that followed felt like glass breaking in my chest. But I smiled, raised my own glass, and said something that would change everything forever. You're absolutely right, Clarissa. Simple is beautiful. In fact, my security team on Serenity Cove thinks so too. The entire table went silent. But that was just the beginning. My name is Jade Ravencrest, and if you've ever been dismissed, mocked, or underestimated because someone judged your life by what they could see on the surface, stay with me, because what happened after my sister met my private island security team will blow your mind. Here's what Clarissa didn't know as she stood there in her designer dress, surrounded by her equally superficial friends in Millbrook's most expensive steakhouse, Goldwater Prime. I wasn't living simply because I had to. I was living simply because I chose to. While she was drowning in credit card debt to maintain her Instagram-perfect lifestyle, posting photos of luxury handbags she couldn't afford and vacations she'd borrowed money for, I was quietly running a tech empire worth more than she could ever imagine. See, 5 years ago, I'd sold my AI software company, Neural Dynamics, to a Fortune 500 corporation for a sum that would make her perfectly contoured jaw drop to the marble loft of her overpriced downtown loft. But instead of flashing my wealth like a peacock, I'd chosen something different. I bought a private island off the coast of the Azorian archipelago. Not one of those tiny rocks you see on TV, but a genuine 400-acre paradise called Serenity Cove, complete with sustainable energy systems, a helipad, a yacht dock, and yes, a full security team that could make Navy SEALs look like mall cops. But in Millbrook, I lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Henderson's flower shop on Maple Street. I drove a reliable 2019 Honda Civic, I shopped at the farmer's market on Saturdays, and bought my coffee from Tommy's Corner Cafe instead of the overpriced chain stores Clarissa frequented. To anyone watching, especially my status-obsessed sister, I was the family disappointment, the one who'd given up after college while she climbed the corporate ladder at Meridian Marketing, a mid-tier advertising firm where she worked 60-hour weeks to afford a lifestyle that was slowly bankrupting her. Clarissa had always been the golden child in our family. Even tonight, at my own birthday celebration that I was paying for, she'd somehow made it about her. She'd arrived fashionably late in an Uber she'd probably put on her already maxed-out credit card, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and immediately started holding court about her latest promotion at work, which I happen to know was really just additional responsibilities without additional pay, but she'd spun it like she was climbing the Fortune 500 ladder. Jade's always been the dreamer, she continued her impromptu roast, her voice carrying that fake sweet tone she had perfected since high school. Remember when she thought she was going to be some big tech entrepreneur? Now look at her, living like she's still in college, no ambition, no drive. But you know what? Some people are just built for ordinary lives. The laughter that followed, helped by her own forced chuckle, nearly gagged me with its dishonesty. The friends around the table, her friends really, since I'd stopped maintaining relationships with people who only saw dollar signs, nodded along like bobbleheads. Miranda Ashworth, whose daddy still paid her rent at 28, Kevin Blackstone, who'd been starting his own business for 3 years while living in his parents' basement, these were the people Clarissa considered successful because they looked the part and talked a good game. But here's what made this moment so perfectly, devastatingly ironic. Earlier that day, I'd been on a video call with Captain Rodriguez, the head of security for Serenity Cove, discussing upgrades to our perimeter defense systems. The island wasn't just my private retreat, it was a fully operational research facility where I continued developing cutting-edge technology with a handpicked team of the world's brightest minds. We were working on projects that would revolutionize everything from renewable energy to medical diagnostics. My simple life in Millbrook was my cover, my way of staying grounded and avoiding the fake relationships that money tends to attract. While Clarissa stressed about making her car payment and juggling multiple credit cards, I owned property across 3 continents. While she posted photos of borrowed luxury to maintain her image, I had actual luxury that I chose not to flaunt. While she worked her life away for someone else's dream, I was living mine, quietly, purposefully, and completely under her radar. The irony was almost too perfect. Here she was, mocking my lack of ambition at a dinner I was paying for, in a restaurant where the wine we were drinking cost more than her monthly salary, surrounded by people who thought success was measured by how much you could pretend to afford. As she finished her little speech and raised her glass in a mock toast to my contentment with mediocrity, I realized something profound. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry or family dynamics. This was about everything wrong with how our society measures worth. Clarissa had become so obsessed with appearing successful that she'd lost sight of what actual success looked like. She was drowning in debt to maintain an image while mocking someone who had achieved everything she claimed to want. But the beautiful part? She was about to find out exactly how wrong she'd been about my simple little life. And once the truth came out, nothing between us would ever be the same again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The silence that followed my mention of Serenity Cove's security team was so thick you could cut it with one of Goldwater Prime's overpriced steak knives. Clarissa's perfectly glossed lips parted slightly, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her mouth. The friends who'd been snickering moments before suddenly found their lobster bisque incredibly fascinating. But I wasn't done. Not even close. I stood up slowly. My simple black dress, which cost $40 from a local boutique, suddenly feeling more elegant than anything Clarissa had ever worn. The entire restaurant seemed to lean in, sensing that something significant was happening at table 12. "You know what, Clarissa?" I said, my voice carrying clearly across the dining room. "You're absolutely right. I do live simply. In fact, I'm so committed to simplicity that I only keep 3 homes. The modest apartment here in Millbrook, the research facility on Serenity Cove, and that little cottage in the Swiss Alps overlooking Lake Thornburg. I find that more than 3 properties becomes unnecessarily complicated. Don't you think?" The color drained from Clarissa's face like someone had pulled a plug. Kevin Blackstone actually choked on his wine, creating a rather ungraceful coughing fit that drew stares from neighboring tables. Miranda Ashworth's fork clattered against her plate as her mouth fell open. I pulled out my phone, not the latest iPhone that everyone expected successful people to carry, but a simple device that did exactly what I needed it to do. Speaking of simple, I continued, scrolling through my messages with theatrical casualness. Captain Rodriguez sent me the most interesting photos today. Apparently, the new defensive perimeter around the island is working beautifully. The motion sensors picked up a pod of dolphins playing near the southern reef this morning. Would you like to see? I held up the phone, showing a crystal clear image of pristine turquoise waters surrounding a lush tropical paradise. In the background, you could just make out the sleek lines of what looked suspiciously like a high-tech facility nestled among palm trees, with a helicopter landing pad gleaming in the morning sun. "This is from the security tower's morning report," I said conversationally, swiping to the next image. "That's the main residence. I kept it small, only 8 bedrooms. Any more than that and you start losing that cozy island feeling, you know?" Clarissa's champagne flute began trembling in her hand. "Jade, what is this?" "Oh, this?" I held up the phone again, this time showing an image of a state-of-the-art laboratory where people in white coats are working with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. This is where we're developing the next generation of neural network processors. Boring tech stuff, really. Nothing as exciting as, what was it you do again? Something with advertising jingles? The entire table sat in stunned silence. Even the waiter, who'd been approaching to refill water glasses, had stopped in mid-stride and was pretending to arrange something at the wine station while obviously eavesdropping. I sat back down and took a delicate sip of my wine, a 1982 Bordeaux that cost more than Clarissa's monthly car payment, though she had no way of knowing that. You know what the funny thing is? I continued, my voice still perfectly calm and conversational. I actually chose to live simply here in Millbrook. After Neural Dynamics sold to Techno Global Industries, I could have bought a mansion on Billionaires Row, hired a full staff, driven a different sports car every day of the week. But I discovered something interesting about that lifestyle. I paused, looking directly at my sister, whose perfectly applied makeup was starting to show stress cracks around her eyes. "It's exhausting," I said softly. "All that performing, all that posturing, all that desperate need to prove your worth through things that don't actually matter." I tried it for about 6 months after the sale went through. Penthouse apartment, personal shopper, drivers, the whole ridiculous circus. And you know what I realized? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The people who were suddenly interested in being my friend weren't actually interested in me. They were interested in what I could do for them. The invitations weren't about my company, they were about my connections. Every conversation became a pitch, every relationship became a transaction. It was the loneliest I'd ever been in my life. Clarissa's eyes were wide now, darting between my face and the phone that still displayed images of tropical paradise and cutting-edge technology. So I made a choice. I decided to live the life I actually wanted, not the life that would impress people who didn't matter. I bought Serenity Cove, all 400 acres of it, and created a place where I could do meaningful work with brilliant people who care about solving real problems, not building personal brands. I gestured around the restaurant, taking in the opulent decor and the other diners who were trying very hard not to stare at our table. "This," I said, "this performance you put on every day, the stress of maintaining an image you can't afford, the constant competition with people whose opinions don't actually affect your life, this is what I walked away from. And honestly, watching you struggle to keep up with it makes me grateful every single day that I chose differently." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Clarissa's friends looked like they'd been hit by lightning, their worldview suddenly tilted off its axis. The woman they'd been pitying moments before had just revealed herself to be living the kind of life they could only dream about. But the real shock was yet to come, because as I reached for my purse to pull out my wallet, I said the words that would change everything. "Captain Rodriguez is actually expecting me back on the island tomorrow. The helicopter picks me up from Millbrook Regional at 10. Would you like to come with me, Clarissa? I think it's time you saw what a simple life really looks like." The invitation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Clarissa's face cycled through emotions faster than a slot machine. Disbelief, confusion, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like fear. Her friends sat frozen, their expensive dinners growing cold as they processed what they'd just witnessed. "You're lying," Clarissa finally whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "This is some kind of elaborate joke. You can't possibly." I reached into my purse and pulled out a simple leather wallet, the same one I'd carried for 3 years, worn and unpretentious. From it, I extracted what looked like an ordinary credit card, except for the distinctive titanium finish and the small logo of a phoenix rising from flames. "Centurion Private Banking," I said, placing the card on the white tablecloth between us. "They only issue these to clients with liquid assets exceeding $50 million. The annual fee alone is more than you make in a year at Meridian Marketing." Miranda Ashworth gasped audibly. Kevin's face had gone pale enough to match the restaurant's expensive china, but Clarissa just stared at the card like it might bite her. "Here's what you don't know about my simple life," I continued, my voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. 3 years ago, while you were posting Instagram stories about your girl boss journey and complaining about your student loans, I was in a boardroom in Geneva finalizing the sale of Neural Dynamics, the technology we developed, artificial intelligence systems that can predict market fluctuations with 97% accuracy. Well, let's just say several governments and corporations found it very valuable. I paused to take another sip of wine, letting the weight of that statement settle over the table like a heavy blanket. The initial offer was $47 million. I countered with $75 million, plus royalties, plus retained rights to certain technological developments. They accepted within 24 hours. Apparently, when you create something that can literally predict the future of global markets, people are willing to pay handsomely for it. Clarissa's champagne flute had been shaking so badly, she finally set it down. That's impossible. You were working out of that tiny office above the print shop on Morrison Street. You had 2 employees and a coffee machine that only worked half the time. 3 employees, actually, I corrected with a small smile, and the coffee machine worked fine. We just told people it was broken so they wouldn't expect us to entertain visitors. We were running calculations that required absolute concentration. Even the smallest interruption could set us back hours. I pulled out my phone again and scrolled to a different folder, one labeled Neural Dynamics Archive. The photo showed the modest office space Clarissa remembered, but now she could see what she'd missed during her rare visits. Banks of high-end computers humming quietly in the corner, whiteboards covered in complex algorithms, and multiple screens displaying real-time financial data from markets around the world.
This was the control center, I said, showing her an image of what looked like mission control for a space launch. Behind that ordinary door marked storage closet was a server room that could process more data per second than most university research facilities. We were running simulations that predicted everything from crop failures in Southeast Asia to currency fluctuations in emerging markets. Kevin finally found his voice. But why? Why hide all this? Why live like you're struggling when you could have anything you want? I laughed. A sound that wasn't entirely pleasant. Because of this exact moment, Kevin. Because I've learned that when people know you have money, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as an opportunity. They calculate your worth based on what you can do for them, not who you are. I turned back to Clarissa, whose makeup was now showing definite signs of stress. Do you remember the last 5 times you called me? Not texted, actually called? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I'll refresh your memory. I continued. December 15th, you needed someone to co-sign for your new apartment because your credit score wasn't high enough. January 8th, you wanted to borrow $2,000 for that networking retreat in Miami that was really just a vacation you couldn't afford. February 22nd, you needed help with your car payment because you'd blown your monthly budget on that designer handbag. March 19th. Stop, Clarissa whispered. March 19th, I continued relentlessly. You called crying because you'd maxed out all your credit cards and needed someone to cover your minimum payments so you wouldn't default. And April 3rd, just 2 weeks ago, you wanted me to invest in your friend's cryptocurrency venture that any first-year economics student could have told you was a pyramid scheme. The silence that followed was deafening. Other diners had given up pretending not to listen and were openly watching our table like it was dinner theater. Every single conversation we've had for the past 18 months has been about money, not about my life, not about your dreams, not about our relationship as sisters, just about what I could give you to help maintain this fantasy lifestyle you've built on credit and delusion. I reached across the table and picked up the titanium card, sliding it back into my wallet. And you know what the saddest part is? I would have helped you if you'd ever once acknowledged that I might have value beyond my ability to solve your financial problems. If you'd ever asked about my work, my interests, my life. If you'd treated me like a sister instead of a last resort bank. Clarissa's eyes were filling with tears now, but I wasn't done. This conversation was 3 years overdue. Instead, you chose to mock my choices tonight, to hold me up as an example of what not to become, to make jokes about my lack of ambition in front of people's respect I never wanted in the first place. I gestured around the table at her friends, who were still sitting in stunned silence. You turned my birthday dinner into a roast session because it made you feel better about your own failures. I stood up again, smoothing down my simple black dress. The helicopter tomorrow morning? That's real. Serenity Cove? Also real. The research facility, the security team, the technology development? All of it real. But here's what's not real anymore. This relationship where I pretend not to notice that you only value me for what I can provide. I pulled a business card from my wallet, heavy cardstock with embossed lettering that read, Dr. Jade Ravencrest, Chief Executive Officer, Ravencrest Technologies. I placed it next to Clarissa's plate. If you ever decide you want to know your sister instead of just using her, that's my direct line. But I'm done pretending that your constant financial crises are my responsibility to solve. I'm done being your safety net while you mock my safety. And I'm definitely done being ashamed of choosing substance over spectacle. I picked up my purse and turned to leave, then paused and looked back at the table one last time. Oh, and Clarissa, the dinner tonight is on me. Consider it my farewell gift to the version of you that thought I wasn't good enough. Maybe the next version will be someone I'd actually want to have as a sister. As I walked toward the exit, I could hear the frantic whispers starting behind me, but I didn't look back. I had a helicopter to catch in the morning, and for the first time in years, I was looking forward to going home. The elevator ride down from Goldwater Prime felt like a descent into a new reality. As the brass doors closed behind me, I pulled out my phone and did something I should have done months ago. I opened my banking app and began systematically cutting every financial lifeline I'd extended to Clarissa over the past 3 years.
The automatic transfer that covered her car insurance? Canceled. The monthly deposit that helped with her rent on that overpriced loft on Riverside Drive? Gone. The credit card I'd given her for emergencies only, that somehow always seemed to have mysterious charges from Nordstrom and that boutique wine bar she frequented, frozen immediately. But I wasn't stopping there. Not anymore. Standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the cool evening air of Millbrook carrying the scent of jasmine from the nearby park, I made a series of calls that would dismantle 3 years of enabling in less than 10 minutes. Cornerstone Properties? This is Dr. Jade Ravencrest. I need to speak with someone about terminating a lease guarantee. Yes, I'll hold. The property management company that oversaw Clarissa's building had required a guarantor when her credit application came back less than stellar. Guess who'd signed those papers, thinking I was helping my sister get on her feet? While I waited, I sent a quick message to my assistant, Petra Blackthorne, who managed my affairs from a secure office in Millbrook's financial district. Petra, I need you to compile a complete financial report of all transfers, payments, and guarantees I've made on behalf of Clarissa Ravencrest over the past 3 years. Include everything: credit card payments, insurance premiums, loan guarantees, even that spa membership she convinced me to pay for. I want dollar amounts, dates, and documentation. Have it ready by morning. Her response came back within seconds. Already pulling the data. Should I also include the investment account you established for her future down payment? I'd forgotten about that. The $50,000 investment account I'd set up, thinking that maybe if Clarissa had a nest egg building for her future, she'd start making more responsible financial decisions. The account she didn't even know existed because I'd planned to surprise her with it when she finally showed some financial maturity. Include everything, I typed back. And Petra, Close that investment account. Transfer the funds back to my primary holdings. Already initiated. Jade, if you don't mind me saying, it's about time. Petra had been working with me since the early days of neural dynamics. She'd watched me build an empire while simultaneously subsidizing my sister's fantasy lifestyle. She'd never said anything directly, but I'd caught her raised eyebrows more than once when processing payments to bail Clarissa out of another self-created financial crisis. The property management company finally picked up. Dr. Ravencrest, yes, we have your file here. You're listed as guarantor for Unit 4B at Riverside Commons. How can we help you tonight? I'm terminating my guarantee effective immediately. Please send the appropriate paperwork to my attorney's office. They'll have everything processed by morning. There was a pause. Ma'am, I need to inform you that the primary tenant is currently 2 months behind on rent. If you terminate the guarantee, we'll need to begin eviction proceedings unless the balance is brought current within 48 hours. 2 months behind. Even with my monthly deposits covering half her rent, Clarissa couldn't manage to pay the remaining portion. I closed my eyes and felt something between anger and profound sadness wash over me. That's no longer my concern, I said quietly. Process the termination. My next call was to Meridian Financial, the credit card company that had issued the secondary card on my account. Within 5 minutes, I'd canceled the card and requested a complete transaction history for the past year. The representative's professional demeanor shifted noticeably when she pulled up my account details and saw exactly who she was dealing with. Dr. Ravencrest, I see here that the secondary card holder has made several large purchases in the past month. Just last week, there was a charge at Bella Luna Spa for $800, and 3 days ago, a purchase at Crystalline Boutique for $1,500. Should we flag these as potentially fraudulent? Bella Luna Spa, the high-end wellness center where Clarissa had been posting Instagram stories about her self-care Sunday treatments. Crystalline Boutique was where she'd bought that designer handbag she'd been carrying tonight, the one she'd probably claimed was an investment piece or necessary for her professional image. No need to flag them. Just ensure the card is completely deactivated and send me the final statement. The secondary card holder will need to make other arrangements for future purchases. As I ended that call, my phone buzzed with a text from Clarissa. Jade, we need to talk. I know you're upset, but let's not do anything rash. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow before you leave for your trip? I stared at the message for a long moment. Even now, even after everything that just happened, she was still trying to manage the situation, to minimize what I'd revealed, to treat my private island and multi-million-dollar empire as a trip that could be discussed over lattes and pastries.
Instead of responding, I opened my contacts and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in months. Benjamin Crawthorne, my financial advisor at Sterling & Associates. Benjamin managed portfolios for some of the wealthiest individuals on the East Coast, and he'd been quietly growing my wealth while I focused on my research. Jade! Benjamin's voice was warm despite the late hour. I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. How was the birthday celebration? Educational, I replied dryly. Benjamin, I need you to review all the financial arrangements I have in place for family members. Every trust, every account, every automatic payment. I want a complete audit by morning. There was a slight pause. Has something happened? You sound different. Something has happened, I confirmed. I finally stopped pretending that generosity and enabling are the same thing. I've been financially supporting someone who thinks I'm a failure, and I'm done. Ah, Benjamin's tone shifted to purely professional. The sister situation. I've been wondering when you'd address that. The numbers were concerning. Nearly $200,000 over 3 years, with no apparent impact on her financial stability or gratitude. $200,000? Hearing the total spoken aloud hit me like a physical blow. I'd been so focused on individual payments, individual crises, individual bailouts, that I'd never calculated the cumulative damage. $200,000 that could have funded scholarships, supported meaningful charities, or simply grown in my investment accounts. Benjamin, I want you to prepare a comprehensive report showing exactly where every penny of that money went. I also want you to establish a new protocol. No one, and I mean no one, gets access to my accounts or credit without going through you personally. No more automatic payments, no more emergency authorizations, no more family exceptions. Consider it done. And, Jade, for what it's worth, this decision shows wisdom, not callousness. True family relationships aren't built on financial dependency. After hanging up with Benjamin, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the late evening traffic flow past on Millbrook's main thoroughfare. Couples walked hand in hand toward the movie theater, families with children headed home from dinner, young professionals hurried toward the trendy bars in the arts district. Normal people, living normal lives, managing their own finances, solving their own problems. I thought about the conversation I just had with Clarissa's property manager, about the credit card charges, about the $200,000 that had disappeared into the black hole of her artificial lifestyle. But mostly, I thought about how light I felt, how free, as if I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't even realized was there until I finally set it down. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Clarissa. Jade, please, I know I messed up tonight, but don't do anything permanent. We're family. This time, I did respond, but with just 4 words. Family doesn't mock family. Then I turned off my phone and walked toward my modest Honda Civic, the car that had somehow become a symbol of my supposed failure in Clarissa's eyes. Tomorrow morning, I'd drive it to Millbrook Regional Airport, where a helicopter would take me home to Serenity Cove. But tonight, I was going to stop by my apartment above Mrs. Henderson's flower shop, pack a bag, and enjoy the profound peace that comes from finally, completely, and irrevocably cutting loose someone who mistook your love for weakness. The old Jade would have felt guilty about the eviction notice Clarissa would receive, about the credit card that would no longer work, about the investment account that would disappear from her future. The new Jade understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's self-destruction. As I drove through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past the coffee shops and bookstores and ordinary places that made up my chosen simple life, I realized something profound. I wasn't just cutting off Clarissa's access to my money, I was cutting off my own access to her judgment, her manipulation, her endless capacity to make me feel small for choosing substance over spectacle. For the first time in 3 years, I was completely, utterly free. I woke up the next morning in my simple apartment above Mrs. Henderson's flower shop, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and utter peace. No anxiety about Clarissa's latest crisis, no dread about checking my phone for desperate messages, no guilt gnawing at my conscience about whether I was doing enough to help my sister maintain her unsustainable lifestyle. For the first time in 3 years, I belonged entirely to myself. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of my bedroom, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors I'd restored myself when I first moved in. Everything in the space was chosen for comfort and functionality, not to impress anyone. The antique oak dresser I'd found at an estate sale in Thornfield, the reading chair positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon sun, the small desk where I sometimes worked on personal projects, surrounded by books about sustainable technology and marine conservation.
This wasn't the apartment of someone who'd given up on life, as Clarissa had implied last night. This was the home of someone who knew exactly what brought them joy and had the confidence to choose it over external validation. My phone sat silent on the nightstand. I'd turned it back on briefly before bed and found 17 missed calls from Clarissa, 6 voicemails, and a string of increasingly frantic text messages that progressed from anger to bargaining to what appeared to be the early stages of panic. I'd read the first few, then turned the phone off again without responding.
The old Jade would have felt compelled to manage Clarissa's emotions, to smooth over the crisis, to fix whatever problems my boundary setting had created. The new Jade understood that Clarissa's feelings about the consequences of her own actions were not my responsibility to manage. At exactly 8:30, I heard the familiar rumble of the delivery truck pulling up outside Mrs. Henderson's shop. Moments later, there was a gentle knock on the door that led to my private entrance. I opened it to find Mrs. Henderson herself, holding a steaming cup of coffee and wearing the kind of knowing smile that comes from decades of observing human nature. "Thought you might need this before your big day," she said, handing me the coffee. "Heard quite a bit of commotion from your phone last night. Everything all right, dear?" Estelle Henderson was 73 years old, had run Thornfield Flowers for 47 years, and possessed the rare gift of being genuinely interested in other people's lives without being nosy about it. She'd become something of a surrogate grandmother to me over the past 3 years, offering wisdom when asked and comfortable silence when needed. "Actually, Mrs. Henderson, everything is perfect for the first time in a very long time," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I'm going home today." "Ah," she said, her eyes twinkling, "that mysterious place you disappear to sometimes, the one that makes you come back looking like you've remembered who you are?" I'd never explicitly told Mrs. Henderson about Serenity Cove, but she was observant enough to notice patterns. She'd seen me leave for weeks at a time and return energized, centered, and eager to dive back into my research. She'd also witnessed the gradual toll that my increasingly frequent family emergencies had taken on my mood and energy levels. "Something like that," I confirmed. "Mrs. Henderson, I want you to know how much I've appreciated having this space, this sanctuary. It's given me exactly what I needed during a complicated time." "Will you be keeping it?" she asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. "I'd hate to lose my favorite tenant. You bring such a peaceful energy to the building." I considered the question seriously. Did I need this apartment anymore? The original purpose had been to maintain connections to my pre-wealth life, to stay grounded, to remember what truly mattered. But over time, it had become something else. A hiding place, a way to avoid dealing with family dynamics that were slowly poisoning my peace of mind. "I think I will," I said finally, "but I might use it differently. Maybe as a writing retreat or a place to come when I want to remember why simplicity matters. Not as a place to hide from my real life, but as a complement to it." Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly. Sometimes we need different kinds of homes for different parts of ourselves. The wise person knows when to use which one. After she left, I packed a single small suitcase, another habit from my simple living phase that I discovered I actually enjoyed. When you know you can have anything, choosing to travel light becomes a form of freedom rather than limitation. I included my favorite research notebooks, a few changes of clothes suitable for both laboratory work and beachside relaxation, and the small collection of books I'd been meaning to read when I had uninterrupted time. As I was preparing to leave, I allowed myself one check of my phone. 23 new messages from Clarissa, ranging from angry, "You can't just abandon family like this," to desperate, "I got an eviction notice, what am I supposed to do?" to manipulative, "Mom and Dad would be ashamed of how selfish you've become." The mention of our parents stopped me cold. Mom and Dad had died in a car accident when Clarissa was 22 and I was 25, just as I was starting Neural Dynamics. Clarissa had leaned heavily on me for emotional support during that time, and I'd gladly provided it. But somewhere along the way, emotional support had morphed into financial dependence, and grief had been weaponized into guilt. Our parents had worked modest jobs. Dad as a high school mathematics teacher, Mom as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital. They lived within their means, saved for retirement, and taught us that love was expressed through time and attention, not through money. They would have been proud of what I'd built with Neural Dynamics, but they would have been horrified to see how Clarissa had turned our relationship into a transaction.
I typed a single response to her flood of messages. Mom and Dad taught us to be self-sufficient and to treat each other with respect. I'm honoring both of those lessons today. Then I turned the phone off again and headed for my car. The drive to Millbrook Regional Airport took exactly 27 minutes through the quiet suburban streets I'd come to know so well. Past the farmer's market, where I bought fresh produce every Saturday, past Tommy's Coffee Corner, where the baristas knew my order by heart, past the small park where I sometimes sat on benches reading technical journals while families played on the playground nearby. These weren't trappings of a failed life, as Clarissa had portrayed them. They were the elements of a chosen life, a deliberate life, a life designed around values rather than appearances. The fact that I could afford to live anywhere in the world made my choice to live here more meaningful, not less. The helicopter was waiting when I arrived, a sleek Sikorsky S-76 that looked impressively out of place against the modest regional airport terminal. Captain Marcus Ravencroft, my personal pilot for the past 2 years, emerged from the aircraft with a welcoming smile. Dr. Ravencrest, welcome back. I trust your time in Millbrook was productive. More productive than I expected, I replied, handing him my suitcase. And Marcus, I think this might be my last extended stay here for a while. I finally figured out the difference between humility and hiding. As the helicopter lifted off, I watched Millbrook shrink beneath us. The neat grid of streets, the modest homes, the simple businesses that made up the fabric of ordinary life. But I wasn't saying goodbye to simplicity. I was saying goodbye to the need to make myself small to make others comfortable. 20 minutes later, the azure waters of the Azurian archipelago came into view, and there it was, Serenity Cove, my sanctuary, my laboratory, my home. 400 acres of pristine tropical paradise where I could pursue meaningful work with brilliant colleagues who understood that true luxury isn't about impressing others, it's about having the freedom to become the fullest version of yourself. As we descended toward the helipad, I could see Captain Rodriguez and his security team conducting their routine perimeter check, the research facility humming with activity, the solar panels glinting in the afternoon sun as they powered cutting-edge technology with clean energy. This wasn't excess. This was purpose. This wasn't showing off. This was showing up for the work that mattered most to me. For 3 years, I'd been living 2 separate lives, thinking I needed to choose between substance and success, between humility and achievement. But as the helicopter touched down on Serenity Cove's landing pad, I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether I deserved to live this life. The question was whether I was brave enough to stop apologizing for it. And finally, gratefully, completely, I was. I'd been back on Serenity Cove for exactly 4 hours when Petra's call came through on the island's secure communication system. I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly reports from the Marine Research Division when her face appeared on the holographic display in my private office, her expression a mixture of professional concern and barely contained amusement. "Jade, I hope you're sitting down," she said without preamble. "Your sister's world is officially collapsing, and it's happening faster than even I anticipated." I leaned back in my chair, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as a pod of dolphins played in the crystal-clear waters surrounding the island. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I was surrounded by this peaceful paradise, Clarissa was apparently experiencing the chaos that comes from having your financial house of cards finally tumble down. "Tell me," I said calmly. Petra consulted her tablet, her efficiency evident even through the holographic projection. First, the eviction notice was served at 9 a.m. this morning, exactly 47 minutes after Cornerstone Properties processed your guarantee termination. Clarissa called their office 6 times before noon, each conversation more frantic than the last. I have the recordings if you want to hear them, but I'll summarize. Lots of shouting, several threats to sue, and at least one instance of her claiming you'd somehow hacked into the system to sabotage her. I couldn't help but smile at that. Hacked the system? She still thinks I'm just playing around with computers in my spare time. It gets better, Petra continued. The credit card company flagged her for suspicious activity when she tried to make a payment on her other cards using the supplementary card you canceled. Apparently, she'd been using your credit to pay the minimum balances on her personal accounts for months. Without that safety net, she defaulted on 3 separate cards by 2 p.m. today.
There's more, Petra said, scrolling through her notes. Bella Luna Spa called our office at 3:15 p.m. trying to verify payment for a platinum wellness package Clarissa apparently booked for next month. $8,000, Jade. She'd signed up for weekly massages, daily meditation sessions, and something called crystal energy alignment therapy for the next 6 months, all charged to the card you canceled. $8,000 at a spa while she couldn't cover her rent. The numbers painted a picture of someone so disconnected from financial reality that she'd essentially been living in a fantasy world subsidized by my guilt and generosity. What did you tell them? I asked. The truth, that the cardholder had terminated the account and they need to contact Miss Ravencrest directly for alternative payment arrangements. They weren't pleased. Apparently, their cancellation policy requires 14 days' notice, and they're threatening to send her to collections for the full amount. I felt a flicker of something that might have been the old guilt, but it passed quickly. Clarissa was 30 years old. She'd had every opportunity to learn how money worked, how contracts functioned, and how actions led to consequences. The fact that she'd chosen to remain willfully ignorant while spending my money with reckless abandon was not my fault to fix. Petra, what's the total financial exposure from today alone? Everything that defaulted because my support disappeared. She pulled up another screen. Conservative estimate, $47,000 in immediate liabilities. That includes the spa package, 3 credit card defaults, the rent arrears, and something called Prestige Auto Leasing that was apparently automatically charging your account for her car payments. I didn't even know about that one until they called asking why their monthly transfer had been declined. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. My sister had been living like a millionaire on my dime, while publicly mocking my simple lifestyle. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. There's one more thing, Petra said, her tone shifting slightly. At 4:30 p.m., Clarissa showed up at our Millbrook office. Security footage shows her demanding to speak with you, claiming there had been some kind of computer error with your accounts. When the receptionist explained that you were unavailable, she became unhinged, is probably the kindest way to put it. A new window opened on my display, showing security footage from the Sterling & Associates building lobby. I watched my sister, dressed in designer clothes she couldn't afford, carrying a handbag worth more than most people's monthly salary, gesticulating wildly at the poor receptionist while a growing crowd of well-dressed professionals looked on with a mixture of concern and secondhand embarrassment. She's claiming that you've had some kind of nervous breakdown, that you're making irrational decisions because you're jealous of her success. She told at least 6 people in that lobby that you're acting out because you can't handle her promotion at work. I laughed out loud at that. Clarissa's promotion at Meridian Marketing, the one she'd bragged about at dinner last night, was essentially a lateral move with more responsibilities and no additional pay. Meanwhile, she was standing in the lobby of one of the most prestigious financial firms on the East Coast, unknowingly making a scene in front of people who managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, including my own. Did anyone recognize her? I asked. Petra's smile was predatory. Benjamin happened to be walking through the lobby when she was in full meltdown mode. He introduced himself as your financial advisor and asked if she'd like him to clarify your current financial status. She told him, and I quote, that you barely have 2 pennies to rub together and that he was obviously confused about which client he was dealing with. The mental image of Clarissa lecturing Benjamin Crawthorne about my financial situation was almost too perfect. Benjamin managed investment portfolios for tech billionaires, pharmaceutical heiresses, and international shipping magnates. He'd probably forgotten more about wealth management than Clarissa would ever learn about basic budgeting. What did Benjamin say? He simply handed her his business card and suggested she might want to research her sister's actual net worth before making public statements about her finances. Then he walked away. Security escorted her out about 10 minutes later when she started demanding access to your accounts. I pulled up my own security feeds from around Millbrook, curious to see what Clarissa had done after being ejected from the financial district. The facial recognition software tracked her movements from the Sterling & Associates building to Crystalline Boutique, where she'd apparently tried to return the $1,500 handbag she'd purchased just days ago, only to be told that returns required the original payment method, which was now defunct. From there, she'd gone to her apartment building, where the footage showed an increasingly animated conversation with what appeared to be a building manager. Even without audio, her body language screamed desperation, hand gestures growing wilder, posture becoming more defensive, facial expressions cycling between anger and panic. The final piece of footage showed her sitting in her car outside Meridian Marketing offices at 6:45 p.m., apparently making phone calls. The timestamp indicated she'd been there for over an hour, which suggested that either no one was answering her calls or the conversations weren't going well.
Petra, I said, I want you to monitor the situation, but don't intervene unless she does something that directly affects our operations or reputation. She's created this crisis through her own choices, and she needs to face the consequences without my interference. Understood. Should I prepare any statements in case this becomes public? She's already told several people that you're having mental health issues. I considered that. Millbrook's social circles were smaller than they appeared, and gossip had a way of spreading quickly through the interconnected networks of professionals, socialites, and business owners. If Clarissa continued her current trajectory of public meltdowns and blame shifting, it might indeed become necessary to set the record straight. Draft something neutral, I said. Focus on the fact that I've chosen to discontinue financial support for family members who haven't demonstrated fiscal responsibility. Don't get into specifics, but make it clear that this is a deliberate business decision, not an emotional breakdown. As Petra signed off, I found myself wondering what Clarissa was thinking right now. Was she beginning to understand the scope of her dependence on my money? Was she calculating how many months she'd been living above her means while criticizing my life choices? Or was she still in denial, convinced that this was all some kind of temporary glitch that could be resolved with the right combination of manipulation and drama? My phone buzzed with a text notification. The first communication I had received directly from Clarissa since arriving on the island. The message was simple, but loaded with implication. Jade, I know you think you're teaching me a lesson, but people are starting to ask questions. We need to fix this before it gets out of hand. I stared at the message for a long moment, struck by the complete absence of accountability in her words. No acknowledgement of her behavior at dinner, no recognition of the financial abuse, no apology for years of taking my support for granted while publicly diminishing my accomplishments. Just a demand that I fix this before her reputation suffered any permanent damage. I deleted the message without responding and turned my attention back to the quarterly reports. Outside my window, the sun was beginning to set over the Pacific, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Tomorrow, my research team would continue working on technologies that could revolutionize renewable energy and medical diagnostics. The Marine Conservation Project would move forward with its study of coral reef restoration. The Humanitarian Technology Initiative would make progress on bringing clean water solutions to underserved communities. Clarissa could keep calling, texting, and making scenes in financial district lobbies. But for the first time in 3 years, her crisis was not my emergency. And the freedom that came with that realization was worth more than the $200,000 I'd wasted trying to buy a relationship with someone who had never really been interested in being my sister, only in having access to my resources. The consequences were cascading exactly as they should. Now it remained to be seen whether Clarissa would learn from them or simply look for new ways to avoid taking responsibility for the life she'd built on borrowed money and borrowed time. 3 days after Clarissa's meltdown at Sterling & Associates, I made a decision that would remove any possibility of ambiguity about our relationship dynamics. It was time to provide undeniable evidence that would make her lies impossible to maintain and force everyone, including Clarissa herself, to confront the truth about who had really been supporting whom.
I was sitting in my private study on Serenity Cove, watching the morning sun illuminate the research facility's solar array when I called Petra with specific instructions. I want you to prepare a comprehensive financial documentation package, I told her. Everything, every transfer, every payment, every guarantee I've made on Clarissa's behalf for the past 3 years. But I don't want just numbers. I want context, comparison, and irrefutable proof. Petra's holographic projection flickered slightly as she accessed multiple databases simultaneously. What kind of format are we talking about? Legal documentation? Financial audit? Something more public-facing? I think of it as an educational presentation, I said carefully. Something that tells the complete story in a way that even people without financial backgrounds can understand. Include photographs, documentation, timestamps, everything needed to paint an accurate picture of the situation. Jade, Petra said, her tone cautious. If Clarissa is already claiming you're having a breakdown, a document like this could be seen as vindictive. I stood and walked to the window, watching a team of marine biologists preparing for their morning dive to study the coral restoration project. These people understood the value of documentation, of evidence, of letting facts speak for themselves, rather than relying on emotional manipulation or social posturing. Petra, what Clarissa doesn't understand is that I've built my entire career on data, on truth, on letting results speak louder than rhetoric. She's betting that I'll stay quiet to avoid family drama, that I'll let her control the narrative because it's easier than defending myself. She's miscalculated.
Understood. How detailed should this be? Exhaustive. I want bank statements, canceled checks, wire transfer confirmations, property guarantees, insurance policies, credit card statements, everything. But also include the context she conveniently omits. Show the dates of her emergencies alongside her social media posts. Cross-reference her claims of financial independence with the actual money flowing from my accounts. Make it impossible for anyone to misunderstand who was supporting whom. Over the next 6 hours, Petra worked with forensic precision to compile what could only be described as a financial biography of Clarissa's dependents. The final document was a 63-page masterpiece of documentation that told a story far more damning than I had even realized. The timeline was devastating. On March 15, 2023, Clarissa had posted an Instagram story about treating herself to a weekend at the Grand View Resort and Spa, hashtagging it with self-made and living my best life. The same day, my account showed a $3,200 transfer to cover her rent after she'd spent her housing money on the resort. On July 4th, 2024, she'd shared photos of herself at a rooftop party wearing a designer dress, captioning it, "Success looks good on me." My credit card statement from that week showed she'd charged $1,800 at Crystalline Boutique on July 2nd. But the most damning evidence wasn't the individual transactions. It was the pattern. Petra had created a dual timeline that showed Clarissa's public persona alongside the private reality of her finances. Every post about her independent lifestyle was matched with documentation of my financial support. Every humble brag about her career success was contrasted with evidence of her inability to cover basic living expenses without my help. The document included photographs of every major purchase she'd made on my credit cards, cross-referenced with her social media posts claiming these items as symbols of her own success. The $8,000 spa package was particularly egregious. She'd actually posted a photo of the contract on her Instagram story, bragging about investing in self-care because successful women prioritize their wellness. Petra had also included what she called the Gratitude Index, a compilation of every text message, email, and voicemail I'd received from Clarissa over the past 3 years. The results were staggering. 247 requests for financial assistance, 31 thank you messages, all of which were immediately followed by additional requests, and absolutely zero instances of her checking on my well-being, asking about my work, or expressing interest in my life unless it related to money she needed. The final section of the document was perhaps the most powerful, a comparison analysis showing what Clarissa's lifestyle would have looked like if she'd lived within her actual means at Meridian Marketing. She'd calculated her take-home pay, then created a realistic budget for someone in her position.
The contrast with her actual lifestyle was jarring. The difference between a modest one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood and her luxury loft on Riverside Drive, between shopping at Target and shopping at Crystalline Boutique, between occasional dinners out and weekly $800 spa treatments. But I wasn't planning to release this document publicly. That would be Clarissa's style, dramatic, attention-seeking, designed to force others to take sides. Instead, I was going to do something far more powerful. I was going to mail copies to every single person who had been at my birthday dinner. The guest list from Goldwater Prime made for interesting reading. Miranda Ashworth, whose father owned half the commercial real estate in Millbrook's downtown, Kevin Blackstone, who worked at the same financial firm where Benjamin managed my investments, Clarissa's supervisor at Meridian Marketing, who had been invited as her +1, the yoga instructor from her exclusive studio, the boutique owner who'd sold her thousands of dollars worth of clothes on my credit cards. Each person would receive an identical package, a cover letter explaining that recent events had made it necessary to clarify certain misconceptions about my financial situation, followed by the complete documentation of my support for Clarissa, and finally a brief summary of my actual accomplishments and net worth, not to boast, but to provide context for understanding why Clarissa's public characterization of my life had been so devastating. The cover letter was carefully worded to avoid sounding vindictive. Dear friends, recent conversations have brought to my attention that there may be some confusion about the financial dynamics within my family. In the interest of clarity and truth, I'm providing documentation that speaks for itself. I have never sought recognition for supporting family members, nor do I regret the assistance I provided when I believed it was helping someone build independence. However, when private generosity is misrepresented as public failure, clarification becomes necessary. The enclosed documentation represents 3 years of financial records. I trust you'll find them illuminating regarding the true nature of my relationship with my sister and the actual source of the lifestyle that she has been portraying as self-generated success. I hope this information helps explain recent events and provides context for any statements you may have heard about my financial stability or life choices. Sincerely, Dr. Jade Ravencrest.
The packages went out via courier on Friday afternoon, timed to arrive when people would have weekend leisure time to review them thoroughly. I specifically requested signature confirmation, not because I was worried about delivery, but because I wanted a record of exactly when each person received their copy of the truth. By Saturday evening, my phone was buzzing with text messages from people who had been at the dinner. Miranda Ashworth was the first to reach out. Jade, I had no idea. I am so sorry for how we reacted the other night. Can we talk? Kevin Blackstone's message was more direct. Holy shit, Jade. I work in finance, and even I'm blown away by these numbers. Your sister has been living like a trust fund baby on your dime while calling you unsuccessful? This is insane. But the most satisfying response came from Dr. Helena Westbrook, the boutique owner who had enabled many of Clarissa's shopping sprees. Her message was brief, but loaded with implications. Dr. Ravencrest, I believe there may be some irregularities with the payment methods used for recent purchases at my establishment. Would you be available to discuss this matter at your convenience? It seemed that Dr. Westbrook had suddenly developed concerns about accepting credit cards from someone who had been claiming the purchases were funded by her own successful career, while the actual cardholder had a different last name and address. I suspected that a conversation with her lawyer had helped clarify the potential legal implications of accepting payment for luxury goods from someone who is essentially engaging in identity theft. Sunday morning brought the response I'd been most curious about, a voicemail from Clarissa's supervisor at Meridian Marketing, Victoria Chen. Her tone was carefully professional, but I could hear the strain underneath. Dr. Ravencrest, this is Victoria Chen from Meridian Marketing. I wanted to reach out regarding some information that has come to my attention about your sister's financial situation. As her supervisor, I need to understand whether there might be any compliance issues related to her representations about her personal financial status. Could we schedule a confidential conversation this week? Translation. Clarissa had been claiming a lifestyle that her actual salary couldn't support, and her employer was now wondering whether she'd been engaging in fraud, embezzlement, or other activities that could expose the company to liability.
By Sunday evening, I had received responses from every single person who had attended my birthday dinner. The tone ranged from apologetic to shocked to concerned, but they all contained the same underlying message. The truth had been far different than what Clarissa had led them to believe. But the most important response hadn't come yet. Clarissa herself had been conspicuously silent since Friday, which suggested that word of the documentation packages had reached her through the Millbrook social network. I imagined her sitting in her overpriced apartment, surrounded by luxury items she couldn't afford, finally understanding that her version of events was about to be thoroughly debunked by people who had seen the actual evidence. The beautiful thing about documentation is that it doesn't argue, doesn't get emotional, and doesn't leave room for interpretation. Numbers don't lie, bank statements don't have agendas, and canceled checks don't engage in manipulation. I'd spent 3 years allowing Clarissa to control the narrative about our relationship because I'd been too focused on preserving peace to insist on truth. But now the truth was out there, documented and verified, impossible to deny or reframe. Anyone who wanted to understand the real dynamics of our family relationship could see exactly what had happened, when it had happened, and who had really been supporting whom. And for the first time since this entire situation began, I was the one controlling the narrative, not through manipulation or emotional blackmail, but through the simple power of undeniable evidence. Tuesday morning brought the inevitable response I'd been expecting since the documentation packages had been delivered. I was reviewing progress reports from the desalination project when Petra's urgent communication came through the island's secure network. "Jade, you need to see this immediately," she said, her professional composure showing cracks of genuine concern. "Clarissa has assembled what can only be described as an intervention team, and they're currently en route to Serenity Cove." I set down my coffee cup slowly, watching through my office windows as a maintenance crew worked on the solar panel arrays. "Explain." "Boat departed from Millbrook Marina 47 minutes ago. Maritime tracking shows it's a chartered yacht, the Fortune's Dream, heading directly for your coordinates. Passenger manifest includes Clarissa, someone named Dr. Patricia Henley, who appears to be a crisis counselor, a man identified as Richard Thornfield, claiming to be a family attorney, and, this is interesting, Miranda Ashworth."
Approximately 90 minutes at current speed. Captain Rodriguez has been monitoring their approach and requests permission to intercept before they reach the protected zone around the island. I considered this carefully. Serenity Cove operated under a complex web of international maritime laws, environmental protection treaties, and private security protocols. The island itself was sovereign territory, which meant uninvited visitors could legally be turned away at the 12 nautical mile boundary. But allowing Clarissa to actually reach the island might provide a more definitive resolution to this situation. Tell Captain Rodriguez to maintain surveillance, but allow them to approach the main dock. I want full documentation of everything that happens. Audio, video, witnesses. If Clarissa wants to play this game, we'll play it by my rules, on my territory. "Jade," Petra said carefully, "are you sure about this? The documentation packages have already accomplished what you intended. Everyone knows the truth now. You don't have to subject yourself to whatever manipulation tactics she's planning." I stood and walked to the window overlooking the island's main harbor, where the research vessels and supply boats moved in their daily routines. In 90 minutes, this peaceful sanctuary would be invaded by someone who had spent 3 years mistaking my generosity for weakness, my privacy for shame, and my choices for failures. Petra, do you know what the most liberating thing about having unlimited resources is? What's that? You never have to accept anyone else's version of reality. Clarissa is about to learn that on my island, with my security team, surrounded by my colleagues who know exactly who I am and what I've accomplished, her manipulation tactics don't just fail, they become evidence of exactly why I was right to cut her off. The next hour and a half passed with military precision. Captain Rodriguez deployed 3 patrol boats to escort the charter yacht safely through the coral reefs surrounding Serenity Cove. Dr. Elena Voss, the island's chief psychologist who normally worked with our research teams on stress management and cognitive performance, volunteered to observe the interaction from a professional perspective. The island's legal team, led by senior counsel Jonathan Blackwater, positioned themselves to document any accusations or threats that might require legal response.
By the time Fortune's dream appeared on the horizon, Serenity Cove looked exactly like what it was, a sophisticated research facility operated by highly educated professionals, protected by world-class security, and owned by someone with the resources to maintain a private island paradise while pursuing meaningful scientific work. I was waiting on the main dock when they arrived, flanked by Captain Rodriguez and Dr. Voss, with Jonathan Blackwater maintaining a discreet distance. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Them arriving as unwelcome intruders in a borrowed boat, me standing on my own property surrounded by people who actually knew and respected me. Clarissa was the first off the boat, wearing what appeared to be carefully chosen, concerned sister attire, a simple sundress and minimal makeup designed to make her look worried and authentic rather than manipulative. The woman behind her, Dr. Henley, clutched a briefcase and wore the kind of earnest expression that suggested she genuinely believed she was here to help someone in crisis. Richard Thornfield looked like central casting's idea of a family lawyer: expensive suit, silver hair, confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. Miranda Ashworth brought up the rear, looking increasingly uncertain as she took in the professional facility, armed security, and obvious wealth surrounding her. Jade, Clarissa began, her voice carrying a tone of forced gentleness I recognized from childhood manipulation attempts. "We're here because we're worried about you. The things you've been saying, the documents you sent, we think you might be experiencing some kind of breakdown." Dr. Henley stepped forward with practiced authority. "Dr. Ravencrest, I'm Dr. Patricia Henley, a licensed crisis intervention specialist. Your sister has expressed serious concerns about your recent behavior and decision-making patterns. She's described incidents of paranoid thinking, financial irrationality, and social isolation that suggest you may be experiencing a psychological crisis." I looked at Dr. Voss, who made a subtle note on her tablet. Having an actual psychologist present to witness someone else's attempted psychological manipulation was proving useful already. "That's fascinating," I replied calmly. "Dr. Henley, what specifically about my recent decisions suggests psychological instability?" "Well," she consulted a folder that Clarissa had obviously prepared, "suddenly cutting off family members financially, making grandiose claims about wealth and property, isolating yourself on a remote island, these are all classic signs of someone experiencing paranoid delusions or manic episodes." Captain Rodriguez coughed slightly, a sound that might have been suppressed laughter. Around us, my actual staff continued their daily routines of maintaining a multi-million-dollar research facility, their presence serving as obvious contradictions to the delusions Dr. Henley was describing. Richard Thornfield cleared his throat authoritatively. "Dr. Ravencrest, I'm here representing your family's interests. We're prepared to help you establish a conservatorship arrangement that would provide appropriate oversight of your finances and medical care during this difficult time." The threat was unveiled now. They weren't just here to manipulate me back into supporting Clarissa. They were here to try to gain legal control over my assets by having me declared incompetent. "How interesting," I said, pulling out my phone. "Jonathan, could you join us, please?"
Jonathan Blackwater approached with the easy confidence of someone who had handled hostile takeover attempts by Fortune 500 companies. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic, as Thornfield clearly recognized a legal adversary rather than a confused victim. Jonathan Blackwater, senior legal counsel for Ravencrest Technologies and the Serenity Cove Research Foundation, he said, extending his hand to Thornfield, "I understand you're here to discuss conservatorship arrangements. I'm afraid any such proceedings would need to be initiated in the jurisdiction where my client maintains legal residence, following proper medical evaluation by court-appointed specialists rather than crisis counselors hired by interested parties." Thornfield's confident demeanor flickered as he realized he was dealing with someone who actually understood the legal complexities involved in what he was attempting. Meanwhile, Dr. Henley was looking around with growing uncertainty. "I was told this was an isolated compound where someone might be hiding from reality," she said slowly. "This appears to be a legitimate research facility." "That's because it is," Dr. Voss interjected smoothly. "I'm Dr. Elena Voss,
chief psychologist for our research teams. Dr. Ravencrest has been my colleague for 2 years, during which time she's demonstrated exceptional mental acuity, emotional stability, and leadership capabilities. I'd be happy to provide professional assessment of her psychological state if there are genuine concerns. Clarissa's carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in real time. Her hired experts were realizing they had been fed false information, her legal threat was being neutralized by actual lawyers, and the delusional compound she described was obviously a sophisticated operation run by competent professionals. "Clarissa," I said quietly, "you've brought these people here under false pretenses. Dr. Henley, Mr. Thornfield, would you like to see the documentation that led me to discontinue financial support for my sister? I think you'll find it illuminating regarding who has been experiencing disconnection from reality." Miranda Ashworth finally spoke up, her voice small. "Clarissa, you told us she was living in some kind of shack, that she'd lost touch with society. This place, these people, she's obviously successful and surrounded by professionals who respect her." The manipulation attempt was falling apart, but Clarissa wasn't finished. I could see the calculation in her eyes as she prepared for one final desperate play, the nuclear option, that she'd probably been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. And I was ready for it. What happened next caught everyone off guard, including me. As Clarissa's manipulation attempt crumbled around her and her hired experts began to realize they had been deceived, Miranda Ashworth stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "Stop!" she said, her voice breaking. "Just everyone, stop! Clarissa, I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of this." Dr. Henley looked between Miranda and Clarissa with growing confusion. "Miss Ashworth, I thought you were here to support your friend during an intervention." "That's what I thought too," Miranda said, turning to face me directly. "Jade, I need to tell you something that I should have said 3 years ago, something that changes everything about this situation." The tension on the dock shifted as everyone sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. Captain Rodriguez stepped slightly closer, his trained instincts recognizing that the dynamic was about to shift in an unexpected direction. Miranda wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "When Clarissa first started asking me to back up her stories about your financial situation, I thought she was just embarrassed about needing help. I figured all siblings go through rough patches and maybe she just needed time to get back on her feet." "Miranda, don't," Clarissa warned, her voice sharp with panic. "No, Clarissa, I should have done this years ago." Miranda turned back to me, her expression filled with a mixture of guilt and determination. "Jade, I knew. I've known for over 2 years that you were the one supporting her. My father's company handles the property management for Riverside Commons. I've seen the payment records, the guarantees, all of it." Dr. Voss made another note on her tablet, clearly interested in this development from a psychological perspective. Dr. Henley looked like she was beginning to understand that she'd been brought here under completely false pretenses. "But that's not the worst part," Miranda continued, her voice growing stronger. "Clarissa didn't just ask me to stay quiet about what I knew. She asked me to actively participate in gaslighting you." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Gaslighting, the systematic psychological manipulation designed to make someone question their own reality, their own perceptions, their own worth. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly, though I suspected I already knew. Miranda looked directly at Clarissa, who had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. She had a whole strategy. She would tell me exactly what to say at social events, how to react when you talked about your work, how to make subtle comments that would reinforce her narrative that you were unsuccessful and living in denial.
She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a lengthy text conversation. "Look, she sent me talking points. When Jade mentions her research, change the subject. If she talks about any business success, look skeptical and ask for details that will make her sound defensive. Always refer to her lifestyle as simple in a way that sounds like a nice way of saying unsuccessful." Dr. Henley was now staring at Clarissa with obvious disgust. "Miss Ravencrest, you hired me to perform a crisis intervention on someone you claimed was having paranoid delusions, but it sounds like you were the one orchestrating a campaign of psychological manipulation." "It wasn't like that," Clarissa said desperately. "I was trying to protect her. She was living so far below her potential, wasting her talents." "Stop." The voice that cut through her excuses wasn't mine. It was Richard Thornfield's. The family attorney she brought to help establish a conservatorship was now looking at her with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd been used to perpetrate fraud. Ms. Ravencrest, Thornfield said coldly, you brought me here under the pretense that your sister was experiencing psychological deterioration that posed danger to herself and others. You provided me with what you claimed was evidence of delusional behavior and financial irresponsibility. If what Ms. Ashworth is saying is true, then you have potentially implicated me in an attempted fraudulent conservatorship. He snapped his briefcase shut with a decisive click. I'll be returning to Millbrook immediately, and I strongly advise you to seek your own legal counsel. Any further communication regarding this matter should go through appropriate legal channels. As Thornfield walked back toward the yacht, clearly eager to distance himself from what was becoming an obvious fraud attempt, Miranda continued her confession. There's more, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The night of your birthday dinner? That wasn't spontaneous. Clarissa planned the whole thing. She knew exactly what she was going to say, and she asked several of us to laugh and play along when she humiliated you. I felt Dr. Voss's hand briefly touch my shoulder, a gesture of professional support that acknowledged the psychological impact of this revelation. The public humiliation that had triggered this entire sequence of events hadn't been a spontaneous moment of cruelty. It had been a calculated attack designed to reinforce 3 years of systematic psychological manipulation. Why? I asked, the word coming out quieter than I intended. Miranda looked at Clarissa, who seemed to have shrunk into herself as her carefully constructed web of lies unraveled. Because she was terrified that you were going to stop supporting her. She'd heard rumors that you were successful. People in Millbrook's financial district were starting to talk about a local tech entrepreneur who'd made it big but kept a low profile. She was afraid that if people knew the truth about your accomplishments, they'd start asking questions about how she could afford her lifestyle on her salary. The psychological sophistication of the manipulation was breathtaking. Clarissa hadn't just been financially dependent on me, she had been systematically undermining my self-perception to ensure I wouldn't develop the confidence to cut her off. Every time I'd questioned whether I was being taken advantage of, there had been a chorus of voices suggesting that I was being paranoid, that I was lucky to have such a successful sister, that my simple lifestyle proved I wasn't really accomplished enough to judge anyone else's choices. Dr. Henley was now staring at Clarissa with obvious disgust. Ms. Ravencrest, you orchestrated a 3-year campaign of psychological abuse against your sister, then hired me to pathologize her when she finally set boundaries. I've seen manipulative family dynamics before, but this level of premeditation is genuinely disturbing. Jonathan Blackwater had been quietly observing the entire exchange, and now he stepped forward with the measured tone of someone documenting potential criminal behavior. Ms. Ashworth, would you be willing to provide written testimony about these conversations and your participation in this campaign? And Ms. Ravencrest, he addressed Clarissa directly. I want to be very clear that attempting to fraudulently establish a conservatorship is a serious felony in multiple jurisdictions. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Miranda pulled out her phone again and scrolled to a different conversation thread. Jade, there's something else you need to know. About your parents' accident. Every person on the dock went silent. Even the ambient sounds of the island, the waves against the shore, the distant hum of the research facility seemed to fade into background noise as Miranda prepared to reveal whatever final secret she'd been carrying. What about the accident? I asked, though something cold was already forming in my stomach. Clarissa told me your parents died because they were driving to meet you. She said they were worried about your financial situation and were coming to stage their own intervention. She said their deaths were essentially your fault because you'd been worrying them with your irresponsible choices.
The dock seemed to tilt beneath my feet. For 3 years, I'd carried guilt about my parents' deaths, wondering if my decision to live simply while building my business had somehow contributed to their concerns, their stress, their decision to drive that night in dangerous weather conditions. But I found the police report, Miranda continued, her voice barely audible. My father's security company has access to those records for insurance purposes. Your parents weren't driving to see you, Jade. They were driving to see Clarissa. She'd called them crying about money problems, claiming she was about to be evicted and needed help immediately. The truth hit
like a physical blow. My parents had died rushing to rescue Clarissa from a financial crisis, probably one of many she'd created and then used to manipulate people into helping her. And for 3 years, she had allowed me to believe that their deaths were somehow connected to disappointment in my choices. Dr. Voss stepped closer, her professional training clearly engaged as she monitored my reaction to the psychological devastation. Captain Rodriguez moved into a protective position, ready to intervene if Clarissa tried to approach me. "Jade," Miranda said, tears flowing freely now, "I am so sorry. I should have told you years ago. I should have refused to participate in any of this. I let my own family's financial connection to the situation cloud my judgment, and I helped someone psychologically abuse you for 3 years." As I processed this information, the systematic gaslighting, the planned humiliation, the manufactured guilt about my parents' deaths, I realized that what I was looking at wasn't just financial dependence or sibling rivalry. This was something much darker, much more calculated, and much more damaging than I had ever imagined. Clarissa wasn't just someone who'd taken advantage of my generosity. She was someone who had systematically undermined my reality, manipulated my grief, and recruited others to participate in an elaborate psychological campaign designed to keep me in a state of self-doubt and emotional vulnerability. And now, finally, the full scope of what I'd been dealing with was visible to everyone present, including Clarissa herself, who could no longer hide behind the fiction that this had all been about family loyalty or concern for my well-being. The complexity I discovered wasn't that some people had been innocent bystanders. The complexity was that the manipulation had been far more sophisticated and far more cruel than even I had realized. The silence that followed Miranda's revelation about our parents' deaths stretched for what felt like an eternity. I stood there, on my own dock, surrounded by professionals who respected me, looking at the wreckage of 3 years of psychological manipulation. But what happened next surprised everyone, including myself. I turned to Miranda, who was still crying, her shoulders shaking with the weight of guilt she'd been carrying. "Miranda," I said quietly, "thank you for telling me the truth. I know that wasn't easy." She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "How can you thank me? I participated in this for years. I helped her hurt you." "Because," I said, feeling Dr. Voss's supportive presence beside me, "you just proved that it's possible for someone to recognize when they've been wrong and take responsibility for it. That matters more than you know." Dr. Henley was packing up her briefcase with obvious disgust, muttering something about filing a complaint with the state licensing board about being used to perpetrate fraud. Richard Thornfield had already departed on the yacht's tender, leaving Clarissa effectively stranded with the consequences of her actions. But Miranda stepped forward again, this time with something that looked like determination replacing the guilt. "Jade, if you'll let me, I want to make this right. Not just the apology, I want to do something concrete." "What do you mean?" I asked. She pulled out her phone and showed me a contact screen. "My father owns half the commercial properties in Millbrook's financial district. He's also on the board of directors for 3 major banks in the region. What Clarissa did, the attempted conservatorship fraud, the systematic financial deception, this needs to be reported to the appropriate authorities." I saw Clarissa's face go white at this suggestion. Criminal investigation into her activities would mean scrutiny of every transaction, every lie, every manipulation she'd perpetrated over the past 3 years. "Miranda, you don't have to," I began. "Yes, I do. And not just because it's the right thing to do, because I work in my father's company and we have fiduciary responsibilities to our clients. If Clarissa has been misrepresenting her financial status to creditors, landlords, or financial institutions, that affects people we do business with. This isn't just personal anymore, it's professional ethics." Dr. Vass had been observing this exchange with the trained eye of someone who understood family dynamics and psychological recovery. She stepped forward now with a suggestion that would change everything. "Ms. Ashworth," she said, "I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility, but I'd like to suggest something that might be more healing for everyone involved than criminal prosecution alone."
What I'm seeing here is a pattern that goes beyond financial fraud.
Dr. Ravencrest has been subjected to systematic psychological abuse designed to undermine her sense of reality and self-worth. Miss Ashworth has been manipulated into participating in that abuse. And Clarissa, she looked at my sister with professional assessment. You appear to be someone who has developed maladaptive coping mechanisms that have escalated into genuinely harmful behavior. She paused, letting that assessment settle over the group. Criminal prosecution will address the legal aspects of what's happened here, but it won't address the psychological damage or help anyone develop healthier patterns going forward. I'd like to propose something more comprehensive. What kind of comprehensive? Miranda asked. Dr. Voss pulled out her tablet and made some notes before responding. Structured accountability with therapeutic support. Miss Ashworth, you've acknowledged your participation and expressed genuine remorse. That suggests you're capable of making different choices going forward. But you'll need support to understand how you are manipulated into participating in the first place. She turned to Clarissa, her tone becoming more clinical. And you, Clarissa, are exhibiting behaviors that suggest underlying psychological issues that go far beyond financial irresponsibility. What you've done to your sister constitutes a form of psychological abuse that requires professional intervention. I don't need therapy, Clarissa said defensively. I was just trying to... You orchestrated a 3-year campaign of psychological manipulation, Dr. Voss interrupted firmly. You allowed your sister to believe she was responsible for your parents' deaths when you knew that wasn't true. You recruited others to participate in undermining her reality. These aren't the actions of someone who is just trying to help. These are the actions of someone who needs serious psychological intervention. Jonathan Blackwater had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest. Dr. Voss, what exactly are you proposing? A structured reconciliation process with built-in accountability measures. For Miss Ashworth, therapy to understand how she was manipulated and to develop skills for recognizing and resisting such manipulation in the future. Financial counseling to help her understand appropriate boundaries around money and family relationships, and concrete actions to repair the damage she helped cause. She turned to me. For Dr. Ravencrest, therapeutic support to process the psychological abuse she's endured and to rebuild trust in her own perceptions and judgment. This kind of systematic gaslighting can have lasting effects even after the truth is revealed. And for Clarissa, I asked, intensive psychological evaluation and treatment. What she's done suggests personality disorder characteristics that require professional intervention, plus financial counseling, addiction assessment, because this pattern of spending behavior combined with manipulation often indicates underlying addiction issues, and restitution planning. Miranda was nodding thoughtfully. What would the accountability measures look like? Dr. Voss consulted her tablet again. Structured financial transparency from Clarissa. Every debt, every asset, every income source documented and monitored. Regular psychological evaluation to track progress. Community service specifically focused on financial literacy education or victim advocacy. And most importantly, a structured plan for making restitution to Dr. Ravencrest that doesn't just focus on money, but addresses the psychological damage. What kind of restitution for psychological damage? I asked, genuinely curious. Truth-telling, Dr. Voss said simply. Clarissa would be required to contact every person who received false information about you and provide accurate corrections. She would need to write detailed letters acknowledging specific instances of manipulation and explaining how she recruited others to participate in undermining your reality. The scope of what Dr. Voss was proposing was staggering. It would require Clarissa to systematically undo every lie she had told, every manipulation she had perpetrated, every instance where she had recruited others to participate in undermining my reality. Miranda was the first to respond. I want to participate in this process, not just as someone being held accountable, but as someone who wants to help make it work. My family's company has resources. We could provide financial monitoring, help with the restitution planning, even funding for the therapeutic interventions if needed. I looked at her carefully. Miranda, why? Why are you willing to do so much to fix this? She met my eyes directly. Because for 3 years, I watched someone systematically abuse my friend, and I helped them do it.
because I convinced myself that staying neutral was the same as staying innocent, when really I was just choosing the side that felt safer. Because I've seen what integrity looks like now, and I want to learn how to have some. Her honesty was devastating and refreshing in equal measure. For the first time since this entire situation began, I was hearing someone take full responsibility for their actions without trying to minimize, excuse, or deflect. Dr. Voss turned to Clarissa, who had been unusually quiet during this exchange. Clarissa, I want to be very clear about something. This structured reconciliation process is contingent on your genuine participation. That means acknowledging the full scope of what you've done, accepting responsibility without minimization or excuse-making, and committing to the therapeutic work necessary to understand why you developed these patterns. And if I refuse? Clarissa asked quietly.
Jonathan Blackwater answered that question. Then we proceed with criminal prosecution for attempted conservatorship fraud, identity theft related to the credit card usage, and potentially additional charges related to financial fraud and elder abuse, depending on what investigation reveals about your manipulation of your parents. Clarissa looked around the dock, at the professionals who had witnessed her manipulation attempt, at Miranda, who had revealed the truth, at me standing in my own successful life surrounded by people who actually knew and respected me. For the first time in our adult relationship, she was seeing the situation clearly. She had no leverage, no manipulation tactics left, and no choice but to face the consequences of her actions. What guarantee do I have that if I participate in this process, the criminal charges won't be filed anyway? She asked. Dr. Voss looked at me. That decision belongs to Dr. Ravencrest. She's the primary victim here. But I will say this, genuine accountability and change are more likely to occur through structured intervention than through incarceration alone. I considered this carefully. The woman standing in front of me had systematically abused me for 3 years, manipulated my grief over our parents' deaths, and recruited others to participate in undermining my reality. Part of me wanted to see her face criminal consequences for what she'd done. But another part of me recognized an opportunity to create something more meaningful than simple punishment, a chance for genuine accountability, real change, and the possibility of an authentic relationship based on truth rather than manipulation. I'll consider the structured reconciliation process, I said finally, but I have conditions. My conditions for the structured reconciliation process were simple in concept but profound in their implications. As I stood on the dock of my private island, surrounded by professionals who had witnessed the complete unraveling of Clarissa's manipulation campaign, I realized that what I was about to propose would test whether genuine change was possible, or whether this was simply another attempt to manipulate me into a more favorable outcome. First condition, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment, complete financial restitution, but not to me. The $200,000 you've taken over 3 years gets donated to organizations that help victims of financial abuse and elder fraud. You don't get to buy your way back into my life by paying me back. You earn your way back by preventing others from experiencing what I went through. Clarissa's face showed a flicker of something that might have been genuine surprise. She'd been expecting to negotiate payment plans or reduced amounts, not to learn that the money would go to helping other victims. Second condition, I continued. The truth-telling process happens publicly, not privately. You don't get to whisper apologies to individuals while maintaining your public image. Every person who received false information about my financial status, mental health, or character gets a public correction through the same channels you used to spread the lies. Dr. Voss nodded approvingly at this stipulation. Public accountability is often the most effective way to ensure lasting change.
It prevents the backsliding that can occur when someone believes they can manage their image while working on their behavior privately. Third condition, I said, turning to look directly at Clarissa, you undergo not just therapy, but a complete psychological evaluation by a panel of specialists who are not connected to you, me, or anyone in Millbrook. If they determine that you have personality disorders or other conditions that make genuine change unlikely, we proceed with criminal prosecution instead of reconciliation. Jonathan Blackwater made a note on his tablet. That's a reasonable safeguard. Some individuals are fundamentally incapable of the kind of authentic change this process requires. But here's the most important condition, I said, my voice softening slightly. I don't want your apologies. I don't want your guilt. I don't want your promises to change or your explanations for why you did what you did. I don't need any of those things anymore. The silence that followed was profound. Miranda looked confused, Dr. Henley seemed intrigued, and Clarissa appeared genuinely stunned by what I'd just said. What I want, I continued, is for you to become someone worth having a relationship with, not for my sake, but for your own. Not because you owe me something, but because you deserve to live a life based on truth rather than manipulation. If that happens, if you genuinely change and become someone who is capable of authentic relationships, then maybe we can rebuild something. But if it doesn't happen, I'm already complete without you. Dr. Voss smiled slightly, recognizing what was happening. Dr. Ravencrest, what you're describing is emotional independence. You've moved beyond needing external validation or reparation to feel whole. Exactly, I said. 3 years ago, I would have done anything to earn Clarissa's love and respect. I would have given her even more money, made even more excuses for her behavior, accepted even more abuse, all because I needed her approval to feel valuable. But standing here now, surrounded by people who actually know me and respect my work, I realize something profound. I don't need her love anymore. I don't need anyone's love who isn't capable of giving it authentically.
I walked to the edge of the dock and looked out over the crystal-clear waters surrounding Serenity Cove. This morning, I received a message from Dr. Cambridge at MIT. They want to collaborate on our neural interface research. Yesterday, the European Space Agency contacted us about adapting our AI systems for their Mars colonization project. Last week, the World Health Organization asked us if we could modify our diagnostic algorithms to help with disease detection in underserved communities. I turned back to face the group. These are the relationships that matter to me now. People who see my work, understand its value, and want to build something meaningful together. People who contribute to my life instead of just taking from it. People who celebrate my successes instead of diminishing them. Clarissa finally found her voice. So, what you're saying is that even if I do everything in this reconciliation process, even if I change completely, you might still not want a relationship with me? What I'm saying, I replied, is that I'm no longer willing to have relationships with people just because we share DNA. I'm only interested in relationships with people who add value to my life and whose lives I can genuinely enhance in return. If you become that person, wonderful. If you don't, I'll be fine either way. Miranda stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. Jade, can I ask you something? 3 years ago, would you have been able to set these boundaries? I considered the question seriously. No. 3 years ago, I was so afraid of being alone, so convinced that family loyalty required endless tolerance for abuse, that I would have accepted any scraps of affection Clarissa offered. I would have been grateful for minimal changes in her behavior. What changed? Dr. Henley asked,
her professional curiosity evident. "I built a life I actually loved," I said simply. When you surround yourself with people who genuinely appreciate you, work that genuinely fulfills you, and purpose that genuinely matters to you, you stop being willing to accept relationships that diminish rather than enhance your existence. Dr. Voss nodded enthusiastically. "This is textbook psychological growth. Dr. Ravencrest has moved from external validation to internal validation, from scarcity thinking to abundance thinking, from codependency to healthy independence." Clarissa was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like respect mixed with genuine bewilderment. "You really don't need me anymore, do you?" "No, I don't need you. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't want a relationship with you if you became someone capable of having an authentic one. The difference is choice versus compulsion. I choose my relationships now based on mutual value and genuine affection, not family obligation or fear of abandonment." Jonathan Blackwater cleared his throat. "Miss Ravencrest, given what Dr. Ravencrest has outlined, are you prepared to commit to the structured reconciliation process with these conditions? Because if not, we should proceed with legal action immediately." Clarissa looked around the dock one more time, at the research facility humming with productive activity, at the security team that clearly respected me, at the professionals who had witnessed her manipulation attempts and seen them fail completely. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was seeing a situation clearly, without the distortion of her own manipulation tactics or the enabling of people who were afraid to tell her the truth. "She needed to ask you something honestly," she said to me. "If I do this whole process, if I really change, if I become someone different, what are the chances you'd actually want me in your life?" I met her eyes directly. "I have no idea. I don't know who you'd become if you stopped manipulating people and started being authentic. I don't know if we'd have anything in common or enjoy each other's company. I don't know if you'd like the person I've become either. But here's what I do know. For the first time in our adult relationship, you just asked me an honest question, instead of trying to manipulate me into giving you the answer you wanted." Dr. Voss stepped forward. "Clarissa, that's actually a very healthy question. It shows you're beginning to understand that relationships require mutual compatibility, not just family obligation. Whether you and your sister end up close, distant, or somewhere in between isn't as important as both of you becoming authentic people who can make that choice freely. So, even if you go through this whole process, you might discover that you don't actually like me when you're not trying to use me, and that would be okay too. Healthy relationships require both people to genuinely enjoy each other's company, not just tolerate each other out of guilt or obligation." The evolution I'd experienced was complete. I had moved beyond needing Clarissa's love, beyond needing her change, beyond needing anything from her at all. I was offering her the opportunity for genuine relationship, but from a place of strength and choice, rather than neediness and desperation.
And for the first time since this entire situation began, I could see something that looked like real respect in her eyes. Not for what I could give her, but for who I had become when I stopped trying to earn her approval and started building a life worthy of my own respect. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I'll do the whole process. Not because I think it guarantees anything, but because I want to find out who I am when I'm not lying to everyone, including myself." It was the first completely honest thing I'd heard her say in years. 6 months later, I stood in the main conference room of the Serenity Cove research facility, looking out over an audience that represented everything I'd built since cutting ties with the toxic dynamics that had once defined my life. The quarterly research symposium had drawn scientists, entrepreneurs, and humanitarian leaders from around the world, People who understood that true success wasn't measured by appearance or social media metrics, but by the impact you had on solving real problems. Dr. Alana Cambridge from MIT was presenting our collaborative work on neural interface technology that could help paralyzed patients regain motor function. Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the World Health Organization was discussing how our diagnostic algorithms had successfully identified early-stage diseases in remote communities across 3 continents. Captain Rodriguez had just finished explaining our marine conservation project's success in restoring coral reef ecosystems using AI-guided environmental management. But the presentation I was most proud of came from an unexpected source. Miranda Ashworth stood at the podium addressing the assembly about her new nonprofit organization, the Financial Abuse Prevention Foundation. 18 months ago, Miranda said, her voice clear and confident, I was unknowingly participating in a systematic campaign of financial and psychological abuse against someone I considered a friend. Today, I'm here to talk about how recognizing that participation changed not just my life, but hopefully the lives of hundreds of other victims of similar abuse. The foundation had been Miranda's idea, but it was funded primarily by Clarissa's restitution payments. True to the conditions I'd set, every penny of the $200,000 Clarissa had taken from me over the years was being used to help other victims of financial exploitation. But more than that, Miranda had leveraged her family's resources and connections to create something genuinely impactful. The foundation provides legal support, financial counseling, and psychological therapy for victims of family financial abuse. We've helped over 300 individuals escape situations where relatives or romantic partners were systematically exploiting their resources while undermining their self-worth. And we've done this by learning from someone who demonstrated that the most powerful response to abuse isn't revenge, it's building something so meaningful that the abuse becomes irrelevant. As Miranda spoke, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the room. Clarissa sat quietly in the last row, wearing simple clothes and no makeup, taking notes on a tablet. She'd been attending these symposiums for the past 3 months, not as a participant, but as someone genuinely trying to understand what meaningful work looked like. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The psychological evaluation panel had diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder and financial addiction, but had also determined that she was capable of change with intensive intervention. Dr. Voss had worked with her twice weekly for 6 months, helping her understand the difference between authentic self-worth and the artificial validation she'd been seeking through manipulation and appearances. The public truth-telling process had been excruciating for Clarissa, but necessary for everyone else. She'd systematically contacted every person who had received false information about my financial status, mental health, or character. She'd posted public corrections on social media, acknowledging her lies and manipulation. She'd written detailed letters to the attendees of my birthday dinner, explaining exactly how she'd orchestrated the humiliation and recruited others to participate. But perhaps most importantly, she'd begun working as a volunteer counselor for the Financial Abuse Prevention Foundation, using her own experience as someone who had perpetrated such abuse to help other victims recognize the warning signs and manipulation tactics they might be experiencing. After the symposium concluded, I found myself on the research facility's observation deck, watching the sun set over the Pacific while reviewing notes from the day's presentations. The quantum computing project was ahead of schedule. The Renewable Energy Initiative had attracted additional funding from the European Union. The medical diagnostic AI was being implemented in hospitals across 4 continents. These weren't just professional accomplishments, they were the tangible results of choosing to build something meaningful rather than waste energy managing toxic relationships. Every hour I'd previously spent managing Clarissa's crises, every ounce of emotional energy I had devoted to earning her approval, every dollar I'd transferred to subsidize her artificial lifestyle, all of that was now channeled into work that actually mattered. Footsteps on the deck behind me announced an arrival, and I turned to see Clarissa approaching hesitantly.
She'd asked to speak with me privately after the symposium, and I had agreed, curious to see what this conversation would reveal about her progress.
"Thank you for letting me attend today," she said, settling into the chair beside me. "I'm beginning to understand what you meant when you said you'd built a life you actually loved." I studied her face, noting the absence of the calculated expressions I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "What did you think of the presentations?" "Honestly, they made me realize how small my world had become," she replied. "I'd been so focused on appearances, on competing with people over things that don't actually matter, that I'd completely lost sight of what it means to contribute something valuable to the world." She pulled out her tablet and showed me a document she'd been working on. "Dr. Voss suggested I write down what I've learned about myself over the past 6 months. I wanted to share some of it with you, if you're interested." I nodded, and she began reading from her notes. "I learned that I'd been addicted to other people's resources, not just money, but emotional energy, attention, and validation. I learned that I'd confused being envied with being respected, and that I'd spent years working to be envied by people whose opinions didn't actually matter to me. I learned that I'd been terrified of being ordinary, without ever considering whether ordinary might actually be peaceful and fulfilling." She paused, scrolling to another section. "I learned that what I thought was protecting you from failure was actually preventing you from sharing your success. I learned that when I made fun of your simple life, I was really expressing fear that you'd found something I couldn't understand. Contentment that didn't depend on external validation." The insights were more sophisticated than I'd expected, suggesting that the therapeutic work had been genuine rather than performative. "But the most important thing I learned," she continued, "is that I don't actually know who I am when I'm not trying to impress people or manipulate them into giving me things. For 30 years, I've been performing a version of myself that I thought would get me what I wanted. Now I'm trying to figure out who I actually am underneath all that performance." I considered her words carefully. "And what are you discovering?" "That I'm much more interested in creating things than consuming them," she said with something that sounded like surprise. "Working with the foundation, helping other people recognize financial abuse patterns, it's the first time I felt like I was contributing something valuable instead of just taking from others." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Clarissa spoke again. "Jade, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you think we'll ever have a real relationship? Not because we're sisters, but because we actually enjoy each other's company?" I thought about the question seriously. "I don't know," I said finally. "But I like the person you're becoming. I like that you're asking honest questions instead of trying to manipulate me into saying what you want to hear. I like that you're doing meaningful work instead of just consuming resources. I like that you're facing your own issues instead of projecting them onto other people." "But," she prompted, "but we're essentially strangers now. We grew up together, but we've never really known each other as adults. You've been performing for 30 years, and I've been hiding for the last 3. We're both finally becoming authentic, but we don't know yet if our authentic selves actually like each other." She nodded thoughtfully. "That's fair, and honestly, it's a relief. It means I don't have to perform for you anymore, and you don't have to manage my emotions. We can just see what happens." "Exactly," I agreed. "And if it turns out we don't have much in common, that's okay too. Healthy families can have members who love each other but aren't particularly close. What matters is that any relationship we have is genuine, rather than based on guilt, obligation, or manipulation." As we sat there under the stars, I realized that this moment represented everything I'd gained by finally setting boundaries and refusing to accept abuse. I wasn't just free from Clarissa's manipulation, I was free to have an authentic relationship with her if one proved possible, and free to live peacefully without one if it didn't.
6 months ago, I'd stood on this same deck feeling the liberation of cutting ties with someone who had systematically abused my generosity. Tonight, I was experiencing something even more powerful. The freedom that comes from building a life so fulfilling that you can offer relationships from a place of abundance rather than need. The research facility hummed quietly around us, filled with brilliant minds working on projects that could change the world. Tomorrow, I'd continue leading work that mattered, surrounded by people who respected my contributions rather than just wanting access to my resources. And if Clarissa continued her authentic growth, perhaps we'd discover whether sisterhood based on mutual respect was possible.
But if not, I had already built something better than the relationship I'd been desperately trying to salvage for years. I'd built a life worth living, work worth doing, and relationships worth having. And no one, not even family, could take that away from me anymore. The girl who had once hidden her success to avoid being used was gone. In her place sat a woman who celebrated her achievements, shared them with people who understood their value, and used them to create meaningful change in the world. And that transformation, more than any revenge or reconciliation, was the real victory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.